Listen, I fucked up, and I know I fucked up because I did way too much, and now we're all gonna have to deal with the consequences of my actions. Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share what will undoubtedly be an absolutely unruly June wrap up. I thought something snapped in me last month, but in June I somehow read, I believe, 17 books, and now I have to talk about every single one. We don't even have time for caveats, but I will say that I can be a little bit chatty in my wrap ups, but I'm really gonna try to walk the line today between being informative and being efficient, because if I don't do that, I will be in serious danger. The first book I read in June was Dan in Green Gables by Rey Tercero and Claudia Aguirre. The author actually got in touch about sending a copy himself, but this came out on June 3rd from Penguin Random House. This is a modern, queer reimagining of Anne of Green Gables about Dan, a mixed-race Latina teenager who's moved around countless times in his life, following the whims of his free-spirited mother. But that still does not prepare him for the moment when she abandons him in Tennessee with two strangers who turn out to be his estranged grandparents. Now he has to adjust to working on the farm, going to a new school, reckoning with his queerness in an extremely Southern Baptist community, but it also presents him with the chance to finally lay down some roots and make a place for himself. Content warnings for brief references to past instances of child abuse, depictions of alcoholism and child abandonment, some experienced homophobia, bullying, and religious bigotry, some use of homophobic slurs, and references to parental death and grief. Not necessarily a content warning, but it's also worth mentioning that this book contains a brief Neil Gaiman reference. I found this to be an incredibly heartfelt and thoughtful modern take on a beloved classic. It's taking all the best parts of Anne of Green Gables and bringing it to the modern sphere with intentionality and thoughtfulness. Even though the story is touching on a lot of difficult topics, abandonment, grief, being othered, prejudice, there's an almost defiant hopefulness and optimism underlying the story. Dan himself is an incredibly headstrong, bold, fearless character who refuses to let anyone make him feel small, and I feel like his unwavering can-do attitude is a big part of what brings this story a sense of balance. Because of how Dan is constantly bumping up against these very strict small-town expectations, I think the story is really speaking to the tension between tradition and modern ways of thinking. And what I appreciate is that Dan isn't necessarily advocating for throwing out the entire rulebook, but instead he's invested in finding ways to meet the townspeople and his family where they are, while also refusing to show up as anything less than himself. And I like that message a lot, that idea that we don't all have to be the same to be unified, and that we don't have to stick to one way of doing things when together we can find and create and imagine new pathways. Again, this is not always an easy story to read. It doesn't shy away from those difficult moments, but at the end of the day, I would absolutely say that it's hopeful and a truly feel-good story. This actually would have been an easy 5 stars for me if it weren't for the fact that the climax and resolution happen within like 3 pages of each other, and then the book just ends. It's very abrupt, but I would still give this 4.75 stars. After that, I listened to Alligator Tears by Edgar Gomez. This came out on February 11th, and I listened to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, which is read by the author themselves. This is another memoir from Edgar Gomez, a queer and non-binary Latina writer whose mother is Nicaraguan and father is Puerto Rican. And this memoir is exploring Edgar's childhood with a focus on his family's experience of poverty and how being ultra aware of what they did and did not have shaped the way that Edgar grew up and how they learned to navigate the world. Content warnings for some descriptions of experienced racism and homophobia, some discussions regarding parental estrangement, some sexual content, instances of gun violence, descriptions of mass shootings, and some explorations of grief. Edgar Gomez is a true memoirist with a capital M. This is the second memoir I've read from them, and every time I pick up their work, I'm reminded of how crafting a powerful and cohesive memoir is an art form that takes an incredible amount of discipline and skill. It is so much more than just recounting or relitigating memories. And I say that because this memoir isn't told in a linear fashion. It touches on so many disparate topics and timelines in Edgar's life that don't seem to have an overt through line on the surface, but each essay feels incredibly grounded in the memoir's central thesis of exploring and debunking poverty, and that idea very subtly underlines and ties together each of these chapters. The work of a memoir is to take the personal and make it feel universal, to take your own lived experiences and make the reader feel as if they have lived them and learned from them in the same way you have, and that's exactly what this memoir does. And besides being an emotionally rich look into the author's life and inner world, world, besides these essays being fully realized doorways of introspection, I deeply respect the commentary Gomez is offering as well in regards to how those who are systematically disenfranchised and relegated to the vicious cycle of poverty are branded as strong, resilient, and resourceful as a cheap consolation prize in exchange for their time, their labor, and their health. And through recounting his experiences growing up, Edgar is dignifying what it looks like to survive in a system that depends on your erasure and demise. He shows us how queerness is the antithesis of the capitalist imagination and how true strength isn't trying to shoulder everything on your own, but knowing when to let your community shoulder some of that weight. This is a truly incredible memoir. I highly recommend it alongside Edgar's debut, High Risk Homosexual. They have an incredible voice and an incredible talent. I couldn't not give this 5 stars. Then I actually finished a series by reading Flight of the Fallen by Hana Lee, the second and final book in the Mage by Courier duology, which came out on June 10th from Saga Press. This is, like I said, the duology closer in Hana Lee's Mad Max Fury Road inspired fantasy, which is set in a world where far-flung citadels are spread out across a ruthless desert, and the only people who venture into the desert are magic users who power their bikes with magic. Not to say too much, but this second installment finds our main cast of characters struggling to survive as mana storms begin raging outside the cities, progressively getting worse and worse, and leaving thousands of unhoused refugees in their wake. Content warnings for descriptions of torture, graphic injury, and violence, brief references to forced sterilization, and some references to mass death and displacement. Also worth noting, Kadrin is dyslexic, and all 3 main characters are bisexual and in a poly relationship. I really love the first book in this duology, Road to Ruin, especially how it blends together those Fury Road aesthetics and establishes a fascinating fantasy world where climate fiction and fantasy play with each other in really interesting ways. To be honest with you, I didn't know if that could be bested, but this second book I think really brings the story home and kind of exceeded my expectations. Road to Ruin walked so that Flight of the Fallen could take off at a dead sprint from the very first page. And I have to give a lot of credit to the world building in the first book, because even without rereading the first book, so much of it immediately flooded back to me because the world, the characters, the scenes were so distinctive. Obviously, this is a sequel and finale, so I can't say too much, but I will say that I found it to be an incredibly satisfying conclusion. I feel like everything set up in the first book paid off here in the second book, and the second book was able to capture that same exhilarating blend of action, magic, and political drama that we saw in the first book. And I just love the revolutionary spirit at the heart of this duology. I appreciate what it has to say about not allowing ourselves to become content or complacent within failing systems, and how the greatest power we possess is our ability not just to choose, but to choose differently from those who came before us. I had a great time with this overall and would absolutely recommend the duology as a whole. I cannot wait to see what Hana Lee writes next, but in the meantime I gave this sequel 4.5 stars. After that I picked up my arc of Cosmic Love at the Multiverse Hair Salon by Annie Mayer. This came out on June 3rd from Ace Books, and I listened to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, which is read by Mia Hutchinson Shaw. This is a queer, speculative, multiverse story about this up-and-coming hairstylist named Tressa Faye, who's accepted that the cost of her success is being single for the rest of her life. But one night she receives a text message from a stranger that turns into something flirty, but when the two of them try to meet, the other woman never shows. Shortly after that, the flirtatious stranger's family shows up at Tressa Faye's salon demanding to know what kind of prank she's pulling because their sister, Meryl, can't have texted anyone because she's been missing for over a month. Content warnings for some references to parental death and grief, experienced infidelity and related trauma, and some explicit sexual content. I think when I'm looking back at the books I read in 2025, this one will definitely stand out as one of the most unique and ambitious stories that I read. It is very much not intuitive to blend quantum theory with hazy sapphic romance, and while that balance doesn't always work out 100% of the time, it does somehow mostly work. First and foremost, I have to say the sapphic yearning in this story is absolutely unmatched. Off the fucking charts. The centering of female desire and the queer feminine gaze is such a mainstay of this story and explored to a level that is absolutely worthy of such a time-bending, time-breaking, epic romance. Sometimes the quantum theory gets a little unwieldy, sometimes the somewhat navel-gazy science gets stuck on things that don't ultimately matter to the story's endgame, but I also really love how the story plays with time, memory warping, and splintering enter universes or realities, because it shows how the love these two characters share is so powerful that it literally impacts and changes the world itself in some ways. And ultimately, I was incredibly moved by what the story is trying to accomplish, how it's showing how these two seemingly ordinary people are worthy of an extraordinary kind of love that defies all the odds. And as the story is propelled forward by this urgent question of whether or not the characters will be able to outmaneuver time itself, there's a lot to be said here about how love is not just a single choice that we make, but a series of sustained, continued choices to keep finding each other over and over again in every iteration of ourselves, no matter what. So I enjoyed the time I spent with this. The audiobook is incredibly well performed as well. The narrator has a sort of fun, quirky read on the story that this somewhat rompy, somewhat serious kind of story really needs, and I loved it. And in the end, I gave this a solid 4 stars. Then I finally listened to Camp by Elsie Rosen, and the audiobook is read by Drew Caden. This is a queer YA rom-com about a teenager named Randy who spends every summer at a summer camp for queer youth. And even though he's this stereotypically flamboyant femme theater gay, he decides to reinvent himself for the summer as a buff, masculine, tragically single guy in hopes of finally winning over his camp crush. Content warnings for references to past experiences of bullying and homophobia, some use of homophobic slurs, explorations of internalized homophobia, toxic masculinity, and misogyny, and some explicit sexual content. Also worth noting, I believe both the main character and his love interest are Jewish, and the love interest is also Korean American. This was such a pleasant surprise. This book has been sitting on my shelf since about 2020 when someone from Quarantine Pages actually shared about it and was very enthusiastic about it, and you know what? I think it's really fantastic. On the one hand, this is very much a campy, no pun intended, rom-com full of summer camp shenanigans, friendships, laughs, and romance. But even though it's very funny and lighthearted, it's also unpacking a lot of complex topics for young readers, like the difference between preferences and prejudice, the everyday toxic masculinity that affects young gay men especially, and what it looks like when we actually give people space to grow and learn from their mistakes. And I feel like the story is really making an argument for multiplicity, because so often we allow the world to boil us down to just one thing. We allow ourselves to be defined by just one thing, so much so that if we try something new or go outside of our comfort zone, it's seen as being inauthentic, when in actuality, it's incredibly normal and healthy to have countless different sides to ourselves, and to have space to express all those different sides. And we don't have to frame those truths as being contradictory, but rather they should be seen as pieces that add up to the expansiveness and the entirety of ourselves. There's a really important reframing there that's happening in this story, because yes, Randy is doing things he's never done before and acting in ways he's never acted before, and while it starts off insincerely as part of this experiment, he also learns that he has the capacity for so many more things than he initially gave himself credit for, because he was allowing himself to be limited to certain stereotypes. So again, you will get all the fun summer camp hijinks you would expect from a rom-com like this, but there's also really important conversations happening in the story as well. There are some moments that are actually deeply uncomfortable, but they're challenging in a necessary way because, again, thematically the story is trending towards growth and expansiveness. Besides not endorsing some of the characters' actions, my one nitpick is that Randy changes his name to Del for the summer as part of his new persona, and a lot of the camp staff who are queer themselves give him a lot of shit about it rather than just accepting it and calling their campers by the name they ask to go by, and I wish that was actually challenged or acknowledged or pushed back against on the page. But as I said, otherwise this was a pleasant surprise overall, and I gave it 4.25 stars. After that, I listened to The No Girlfriend Rule by Kristen Randall, which is read by Natalie Naudus. This is a queer, nerdy YA romance about an anxious teenager named Hollis who really wants to get into the tabletop RPG world, but all the players in her boyfriend's party have a strict rule where they don't let girlfriends or significant others join their ongoing campaign. So she has to find herself a whole new group to play with, and that's how she stumbles upon this all-girls game of SNS, the fictional equivalent of D&D. And the story is about Hollis making friends with these other players, learning what it means to belong, and her beginning to feel just a little bit less lost. Content warnings for experienced sexism, descriptions of homophobia and transphobia, and some depictions of anxiety and anxiety attacks. Also worth noting, Hollis is fat, I believe bisexual, has anxiety, and also takes anxiety meds. I love this so much. It really is this nerdy, feel-good, heartfelt, slice-of-life contemporary story just following Hollis throughout the school year as she learns more and more about the tabletop RPG world and realizes that she hasn't just found a group of fellow players, but a group of true friends. I also really enjoyed how the group group's SNS campaign is woven into the story. It very much feels like a story within a story, but the author knows when to zoom in and zoom out of the campaign, when to let certain scenes play out and allow us to see the character choices the players are making, and when to skip over the less relevant parts. There's a really great balance between real-world moments and RPG moments, but also because there are these two parallel stories unfolding, it also opens up a lot of really wonderful possibilities for the underlying romance developing between Hollis and Annie, because they have a sort of safe space to explore that attraction with their characters in the game before they decide whether they want to act on it in real life. And I think safe is just the perfect description for this group that Hollis finds. They provide such a sharp, wholesome contrast to Hollis's longtime friend group, who are mostly friends of her boyfriend and then with her by association. And it's really lovely to see her realize that true friendship is meant to pour into you and add to your life in meaningful ways, as opposed to just being comfortable and something that you go through the motions with. While there is a really sweet budding sapphic romance and Hollis is gradually coming to terms with her queerness, what I really loved about this story is that it's a celebration of falling in love with your friends and also learning how to fall in love with yourself and show up for yourself when it really counts. That confidence, that sense of self, is something that Hollis gains from playing this tabletop RPG with people who give her the space to make mistakes, to try again, and to evolve in ways that she could never know to expect. This was fantastic. Very fun, very cute. I highly recommend it, especially if you love nerdy sapphic romances. I gave it a solid 4.5 stars. I then continued my audiobook spree by listening to my ALC of And They Were Roommates by Paige Powers, which came out on May 27th from Fierce Reads. I listened to the audiobook courtesy of Macmillan Audio, which is read by Ben Balmaceda. This is a queer second chance rom-com about a trans boy named Charlie who's worked incredibly hard to receive a prestigious scholarship to an elite all-boys private school, and his plan is to keep his nose down and go stealth so that no one finds out that he's trans. But while he thought he was paying extra for a single room, he ends up with a roommate, and not just any roommate, but a boy named Jasper Grimes who happened to know Charlie pre-transition and also broke his heart. Content warnings for some explorations of classism, transphobia, and homophobia, and some depictions of body insecurity and gender dysphoria. After reading this second book from Paige Powers, I can officially confirm that his style, his shitposty humor, his aesthetic is something I very much vibe with. He's somehow able to capture the feeling you get when you're watching a zany, over-the-top anime comedy in his prose, which is so fun and so unique. The Borrow a Boyfriend Club had very obvious Ouran High School Host Club inspirations because it's about an underground club of guys who get hired as people's dates for different occasions, and surprisingly, this book also has Ouran vibes because there's another underground operation happening at this private school that is run by an endearing yet earnestly idiotic group of guys. So this is a very satirical, over-the-top kind of comedy. It's a very specific kind of comedy that may not make sense if you never encountered that specific kind of tone that you would find in a comedic anime. But I am very familiar with that kind of comedic tone and I enjoyed it very much. And even though it's a very funny, lighthearted, unserious kind of story, I think it's also speaking to the enormous amount of energy that trans people especially have to expend when it comes to considering our safety and our privacy on a day-to-day and even moment-to-moment basis. The mental calculus we have to run sometimes just to make ourselves seem innocuous when we're trying to get through the most basic of interactions or transactions is so much more than I think the average person would expect. And by using satire and comedy, the story is able to portray that in its own unique way. So I definitely enjoyed my time with this audiobook. The narrator is also very committed to the bit, which I love for a story like this. There were some relationships, especially with supporting characters like Charlie's mom and his best friend, that could have used more page time and more development, but overall I still enjoyed this and would give it a solid 4 stars. The next audiobook I listened to after that was We Can Never Leave by H.E. Edgman. This came out from Wednesday Books on June 10th, but I pre-ordered the audiobook myself, which is read by Vico Ortiz. This is a dark contemporary fantasy story pitched as Sweet Tooth meets the Raven Boys. It follows a bunch of characters who are sort of chimeric in nature. They're part human, part creatures, and because they don't fully fit into the human world, they're picked up by this traveling caravan full of other non-humans. And so 5 teenagers in this caravan wake up one morning to find out that the rest of their community has seemingly disappeared overnight without a trace. content warnings for some depictions of child abuse and child neglect, brief instances of misgendering, and some depictions of self-loathing, injury, and violence. Historically speaking, I have loved pretty much everything I've read from H.E. Edgman, and while I did really enjoy this story and respect its project, I will preface my thoughts by saying that this was not one of my favorite H.E. Edgman books, but that's okay, and it also doesn't mean it was bad. H.E. describes this as being perfect for people who enjoy watching cult documentaries, religious trauma, and books where nothing happens and everything is terrible, which I think absolutely checks out. In their author note, H.E. also talks about their experience growing up as a Southern evangelist and how those experiences inspired this story, and I do think The Caravan is absolutely a clear and effective metaphor for the experience of being indoctrinated into a religion or way of life that you're not fully equipped to understand. So I do appreciate the way the story is jumping back and forth between before and after to show how these characters are really bumping up against the boundaries of the world they once believed was real and reckoning with the fact that the truth they've clung to all these years might be nothing more than a fabrication. And in true H.E. Edgman fashion, everyone in this story is a fucking mess, and I love that. It's a no-holds-barred kind of story where the characters hurt each other and are hurt by each other and then have to eventually reckon with those consequences. It's not a story about redemption, which I actually appreciate because that would be the easy, obvious route to take, but rather it's showing how embracing your own agency, as empowering as that might sound, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make the right choices. And in fact, it's a testament to how doing what you feel is necessary, doing what you feel obligated to do, doing something for the sake of other people is not the same as a choice freely made. And what does it look like to survive when all of our choices are taken away from us? So a lot of interesting things to think about for sure, and aesthetically, I love what the story is doing with this cast of characters and their unique forms of magic, but broadly speaking, I just think I needed more from every aspect of the story, which is why I gave this 3.5 stars. Then I finally got a chance to pick up So Many Stars, an oral history of trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and two-spirit people of color by Quero de Robertes. I listened to the audiobook courtesy of Libro FM, which is read by the author themselves. As you might be able to guess from the title, this is a nonfiction book, and it's a transcription of oral interviews the author conducted with BIPOC individuals who are queer or trans or both. And it's chronicling their experiences, their histories, and their insights that they have to offer to the next generation. Content warnings for references to experienced bullying, homophobia, transphobia, and ableism, brief mentions of assault, some mentions of suicide and suicide ideation, brief discussions regarding child abuse and sexual abuse, some mention of drug addiction and drug abuse, explorations of family disownment, deportation, detainment, and abduction, and some use of outdated language and epithets. I have so much love and respect for this project, which was an incredibly ambitious undertaking, but I think it was executed with so much care and love and thoughtfulness. I especially love that Garo made this an oral history as opposed to traditional nonfiction reportage, because it made it feel like the subjects were really speaking not only for themselves, but also directly to the audience. To allow these elders the chance to speak for themselves and express themselves in their own words is such an incredible gift. And the overwhelming feeling I had while listening to this was just a feeling of gratitude, feeling thankful to have access to these firsthand accounts that we otherwise might not have. This project is a very necessary and timely reminder of how so many conversations we're still having today are conversations that have been debated and relitigated in so many different forms countless times before, and also so much of the persecution and hate we're forced to endure has also been endured time and time again. It's so incredibly invaluable to hear these accounts of how these queer and trans elders organized themselves, found strength and resources in their community, and found ways to survive and even thrive when they were told, either explicitly or implicitly, that they had no futures. And because this book is structured in such a way where the author poses a question and then gives each subject the chance to answer that question before moving on to another topic, it ends up echoing the sentiment imparted in the title and really feeling like a constellation where each star and each pinprick of light is shining from a different voice. I do have some formatting nitpicks as someone who listened to this entirely on audio. First, I wish there had been a full cast so that each subject had their own distinctive voice, and I also wish there were bios for each subject included in the audiobook to contextualize and honor the contributions of each subject. Generally speaking, I think it also would have been helpful if pronouns and other applicable labels were included each time a different name was reintroduced, because otherwise it can be difficult to contextualize the subjects within their own unique experiences. But again, this was an incredibly ambitious project that I think was pulled off with a tremendous amount of care. I definitely recommend it, and I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, I picked up The Lilac People by Milo Todd. I was kindly gifted a finished copy by Counterpoint Press, and I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Max Myers. This is a trans historical fiction story that explores two different timelines set in Berlin during the early 1900s, both before World War II and after World War II. The story follows a trans man named Bertie who was employed by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld at the Institute of Sexual Science, which allowed him to medically transition. But when Hitler begins rising to power, Bertie and his girlfriend Sophie have to go into hiding and survive by assuming the identities of an elderly couple and living in near isolation for almost a decade. As the war begins to subside, Bertie and Sophie are actually still in danger because the Allied forces are freeing the Jews and other prisoners, but they're still arresting queer and trans folks. And so ironically, their only salvation is to try and escape to the United States. Content warnings for experienced homophobia, transphobia, and anti-Semitism, and descriptions of extermination, abduction, rape, sexual abuse, physical abuse, torture, and other trauma relating to the Holocaust. Also worth noting, Bertie is both bisexual and trans. This is the kind of book that reminds me why I love historical fiction so much, especially queer historical fiction, because it's a genre that restores knowledge that's been lost or undervalued and finds ways to share and redistribute that knowledge in narratively compelling ways. This book is definitely an intense survival story that pulls no punches when it comes to excavating painful history surrounding the Holocaust, especially those lesser told stories and histories that have been kept from the collective conscience. Even though they're very different books, I was reminded a lot of The Other Olympians while reading this because both books excavate this radically queer and radically trans moment in history pre-World War II where trans people actually had the means to live full, visible lives and where their identities were actually backed by force of law and governing institutions. So this is really a story reckoning with how the rise of fascism and white supremacy really set back a surprising amount of progress that was being made in the early 1900s up to that point. There's a lot to talk about there, but I will not get stuck in those weeds. Not only is this a story about impossible survival and the beauty of found family, but it's really making a statement about how history is so much more than just the objects and the records we preserve. History is something that we carry with us. It's a story that's told on our bodies and something that is inextricably part of us. Because these characters are trying to escape their country, there are so many material things they're forced to leave behind or even destroy so as to cover their tracks. Their photographs, books, clothes, employment records, identification papers. And even though they're grieving the loss of those things, they're also realizing that the stories and experiences that still live within them also have value and are things that cannot be taken away. Again, this is definitely a harrowing story at times, but it's also hopeful and centering characters who are fighting to live the lives they know they deserve. It's a powerful and informative piece of history that is rarely told with the reverence and nuance seen in these pages. I definitely recommend it, and I would give it 4.5 stars. Then on the very enthusiastic recommendation of my friend Andrea, I went to my local library and checked out The Darkness Outside Us by Elliot Schreffer. This is a queer YA sci-fi thriller set aboard a spaceship that's been deployed on an emergency rescue mission in response to a distress signal coming from a spacecraft that humankind has sent out to establish a human colony in space. The main character, Ambrose, was chosen especially for this rescue mission, but he has no memory of the launch itself, and not only that, but he is realizing that he is not the only person on board this ship. Content warnings for depictions of graphic violence, injury, and death, some explorations of loss and grief, brief references to suicide ideation, and some fade to black sexual content. This duology has been on my radar for literal years, and I'm so glad Andrea gave me the push to finally start it because it was so engrossing from start to finish, and it was such a pleasant surprise. This is definitely one of those what the fuck is going on kind of stories where figuring out what is actually objectively happening to the characters is a central question of interest. From page 1, you are thrown into the deep end where things are already in motion as the story begins, and you're able to gradually discover more about this ship and this mission in real time alongside the characters. I love that mystery, that intensity, that urgency that you organically get from a story like this, where the characters are entirely dependent on their equipment, their surroundings, and their instincts in order to survive. And I think it's so fascinating what the story is doing by playing incredibly advanced technology against the comparatively crude survival skills and instincts that have been drilled into these two trainees. And aside from the mystery, the action, the intensity, I also appreciate how the story is grappling with the question of what drives us to survive when it's not easy or even possible to see what kind of future lies ahead of us. What do we hold on to? How do we motivate ourselves to keep going even when we have no way of knowing whether the future we're fighting for even exists? There's a lot there for the story to unpack, which I think it very successfully does by using that element of mystery and also the almost fated connection between the two main characters. This was awesome. I'm very glad it's a duology because there are a lot of unanswered questions and loose ends, some that I think we'll pick up in the sequel and some that I'm sure we won't, but this was a solid duology opener and I really appreciate the ambition and the big picture questions this story is trying to ask. I gave this 4.25 stars. Then, as you may have heard, I hosted a read-along for Immaculate Conception by Ling Ling Huang. The read-along was kindly sponsored by Penguin Random House, but I actually pre-ordered a copy for myself. This is a very bizarre blend of speculative fiction, sci-fi, and horror. The story is following a young artist named Enka who made her way into this prestigious art school but feels very insecure in her artistry compared to her peers. She ends up becoming close friends with a girl named Matilda who everyone believes is an artistic genius. So obviously Enka is desperate to keep Matilda close, and that's when she hears about this groundbreaking new technology called Scaffold that actually allows someone to inhabit another person's mind, to feel their feelings and even think their thoughts. Content warnings for depictions of injury and blood, some instances of body horror, some explorations of parental death, child death, and grief, some depictions of depressive episodes, and non-graphic references to past experiences of sexual abuse. I'm just going to say up front that I do not have the space or capacity to truly do this book justice and touch on everything it's trying to accomplish because there is so much and there's so much worth discussing to unpack. But suffice to say, this was an incredibly worthy follow-up to Natural Beauty, and Ling Ling Huang absolutely does not disappoint. Much like in Natural Beauty, this story follows a deeply insecure, deeply unreliable narrator who lures you in with their mundanity and then turns out to be an unhinged agent of chaos. There is so much in this story about how much value we put on originality, and by extension, the exceptionalism of people we deem to be prolific minds and visionaries, and how that emphasis on singularity actually limits the kinds of stories we can tell and the kinds of art and expression that we can create. That is such an important message, especially as we continue careening towards these new, unstable, untested forms of technology that feed off things that have already been created and regurgitates them into something quote-unquote new that's actually derivative at best and outright stolen at worst. There's a tension there, and I feel like that's really the crux of the story, the fact that we prize individualism and praise work that is quote-unquote wholly unique when actually all art, no matter what form it takes or what medium it's in, is inextricably created within a larger, ongoing cultural conversation that never ends. Everything that is created is in conversation with not only what came before, but also with what is yet to come. And this urge to box everything off and create these strict boundaries around what art is and what it can be is actually a symptom of deeply colonial violence. That is just the tip of the iceberg. I feel like I'm not even making my points. There is so much more worth discussing in the story, and it's doing so many fascinating things that are presented from this deeply disturbing, uncomfortable narrative lens. I do wish there was a little more catharsis, a bit more depth to the character arc by the end, but that is a relatively minor note. I still love this, and I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, I finally finished another duology with I Am the Dark That Answers When You Call by Jameson Shea. I listened to the audiobook courtesy of Macmillan Audio, which is read by Crystalline Lloyd. This is the sequel to I Feed Her to the Beast and the Beast Is Me, once again following a black, queer, former ballerina named Lore, who's been spiraling ever since a horrible accident forever altered her relationship to dance. In the first book, she pledged her soul to a river of blood in exchange for power and influence, and now that same river, that same underground world, is actually dying, and its strange powers are beginning to spill out onto the streets of Paris. Content warnings for death and grief, explorations of child abandonment, abandonment and abuse, some depictions of gore, blood, dead bodies, and animal carcasses, some descriptions of body horror, murder, torture, cannibalism, vomit, and claustrophobia, and some depictions of underage drug and alcohol abuse. You might recall that I Feed Her to the Beast and the Beast is Me was one of my favorite books of 2023. That book is deliciously gruesome and vicious. It takes no prisoners, and I love that it's a story about a queer black ballet dancer not just refusing to make herself small, but instead making herself undeniable in her pursuit of greatness. While this sequel has a very different narrative trajectory, I think it still embodies that same darkness, energy, and aesthetic. But at the same time, I think this sequel shows a very different side to Lore. If the first book was about her rage and ruthlessness, this sequel is about the pain and grief underscoring that rage. I appreciate how this second installment is showing how even though Lore has come into her own power, so to speak, she's still struggling to figure out where she belongs. It's really about how life is a never-ending series of being uprooted from what you knew before and who you were before, how none of us are powerful enough to avoid changing or being changed by the world around us. So how do we find our footing within that constant shifting? How do we ground ourselves and keep finding pathways that lead us out of the maze that is lifelong uncertainty? And the story also has a lot to say about how even though we may have the capacity to be strong and fend for ourselves, that doesn't mean we should have to be strong. To need other people is to be human, and to depend on people other than ourselves is not a weakness. So again, it makes a really compelling bookend to the duology, both in comparison to and contrast with the first book. I don't think it's quite as strong as the first book, and I wanted a bit more development and catharsis from some of the relationship dynamics by the end, because it kind of wraps up a little too neatly for my taste, but I still gave this 4.25 stars. On a totally different note, after that, on a whim, I picked up Sex Is as Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity by Paisley Cura. This is a sort of academic nonfiction text written by a trans professor and researcher who actually co-founded the leading journal in transgender studies, Transgender Studies Quarterly, alongside Susan Stryker. In this book, the author is exploring the discrepancies of sex classification between different institutions, such as the DMV, the Social Security Bureau, civil courts, incarceration facilities, etc., which can often hold conflicting definitions of sex for the same person depending on the circumstances. And as the title suggests, this research is not particularly interested in the definition of sex so much as the function of sex classification itself and what kinds of tangible actions and consequences that sex holds according to these different state actors, as well as the implications that has for transgender populations and other vulnerable populations. Content warnings for explorations of transphobia and homophobia, descriptions of misgendering and use of transphobic language and outdated epithets, and some discussions regarding gender essentialism, including medical essentialism. This book rocked my fucking world. It's another one I will not be able to even come close to doing justice, but it is so incredibly worthwhile and has so much to offer that I can't even begin to put into words. This book really and truly troubled the boundaries of my thinking on this issue in a really good way. It challenged me in more ways than one and really expanded my understanding of how sex classification functions. Different governing bodies have different standards by which they classify or recognize somebody's sex based on the function or service they aim to provide, and those parameters, more often than not, are based on leveraging the interest of the state. And as the book argues, sex misclassification has less to do with systemic transphobia, although it does have transphobic effects, and more to do with the policing, tracking, and surveilling of people and the distribution of resources in a way that furthers the governmental and colonial project. And I really appreciate how this book defines sex for its purposes, not as what body parts you have or don't have, what your gender identity is, even what your legal documents say, but rather sex, literally and materially, is whatever classification is backed by force of law. Because at the end of the day, that is the bedrock upon which it is decided whether or not your sex classification can change. I also deeply appreciate how expansive and intersectional this book is in its analysis. It touches on how legal classification and misclassification are issues that don't just affect trans people, but also have historically impacted formerly enslaved people, indigenous communities, immigrant communities, and so many other vulnerable populations. It also brings the necessity of prison abolition, new waves of feminism, and other abolitionist projects into the fold, which I think only further underscores the necessity and urgency behind this analysis and research. To be clear, this is not what I would call a beginner text, especially if you're newer to nonfiction, but if you're interested in this topic, I cannot recommend it highly enough. I wouldn't say it's a perfectly constructed argument, but because it broke open and expanded my brain in so many satisfying ways, I have to give it 5 stars. Then my Patreon pick for June was ASL by Jean Thornton. This is a queer dual timeline story partially set in the late 90s and partially set in the 2010s, following a group of queer and trans friends who meet each other online in 1998 and begin developing a video game together called Saga of the Sorceress. But something happens and the leader of the group decides to completely shutter the project and cut themselves off from the other two, effectively ending their friendship and causing the group to lose touch. About 18 years later, these former friends have come out as queer and trans, and they're living less than remarkable lives. But then they realize that 2 of them live in New York and the other one lives in New Jersey, which means they might have a chance to finally meet each other and finish the game they once started. Content warnings for some use of homophobic and transphobic language, including outdated epithets, some experienced transphobia, depictions of self-loathing, self-harm, and self-harm ideation, and some explicit sexual content, including sexual coercion. I'll start by saying that I liked this, but I didn't love it. I do appreciate that this is a bold and experimental depiction of trans women who are deeply toxic and fucked up and lost. I think we need more stories like this that de-romanticize the notion of transition and visibility, not because those can't be positive things, but because they don't magically fix everything about a trans person's life. I can really appreciate how gritty and unforgiving the story is in that respect, showing how deeply messed up these characters are, and that even though they're closer to the truth of themselves than they were as kids, that doesn't mean they have everything figured out, and that doesn't mean that they're absolved of their past mistakes. I also like the way the story parallels video games to the experience of transness, especially what it means to exact agency over another body, what it means to occupy a world with both controllable and permeable boundaries, and the appeal of gamifying your own survival and existence. There's a lot to appreciate in that respect, and the story also has a lot to say about the dangerous pool of nostalgia. But besides that, I think I just wanted more substance overall from the characters. Despite the fact that this book is almost 500 pages, nothing really happens, and the story doesn't really take advantage of that space. It was a good, solidly respectable story. It was a weird story, but it could have done so much more, and ultimately I don't think it'll stay with me for a very long time, which is why I gave it an even 3 stars. Then I picked up another book I had never heard of before until a close friend recommended it, and that was Puzzle Heart by Jen Reese. I checked out the audiobook from my library, which is read by Avi Roque. This is a queer middle grade adventure about a non-binary kid named Perigri who's determined to help their dad find his way out of his grief that he's been experiencing ever since his father passed away. So Perigri's big plan is to take a road trip to their dad's childhood home, which is actually a mysterious bed and breakfast that their grandparents designed but was never open to the public. But this house has a mind of its own. The hallways shift around, strange paintings lurk in the shadows, encoded messages are hidden everywhere, and as the house's puzzles become progressively more and more dangerous, Perigri will have to solve every last riddle to uncover the mystery at the heart of this house. Content warnings for some explorations of death and grief, some descriptions of thematic danger and injury, and brief depictions of anxiety and panic attacks. This book was so much fun to read, and I think it blends adventuring and puzzle solving with a surprising amount of emotional depth, and in the end, that combination really works. This is very much an exciting, boisterous adventure story in the same vein as the Mr. Lemoncello series, the Green Glass House series, and even classics like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It's that classic setup of a mysterious building full of puzzles and riddles and mysteries that the young characters have to solve. And I really love that aspect of the story, especially for young readers, because it actually has a lot to offer in the way of practical information about things like safety practices, survival skills, and problem solving through a methodical and even scientific approach. I love that that's a central part of the story, because especially for young folks, there are so many times when they'll come up against a problem and feel like they're powerless to solve it or to figure out a solution. But this story celebrates young characters who are not just confident in their abilities, but also patient and thoughtful, and who know when to take a step back and approach a problem from a different perspective or direction. And related to that, I really appreciate how the story makes a distinction between problems that are meant to be solved, like puzzles and riddles, and other things in life that are not meant to be fixed or solved. People, for example, are not meant to be fixed. They're meant to be loved and supported. Again, especially for younger audiences, I think that's an incredibly important message, that some things in life have an objective solution and some things don't. And sometimes when we can't solve or change something, that doesn't mean that we've failed. It just means we have to reframe the way we think about those complexities. So this story definitely delivers on the adventure, the mystery, the magic, but it also has emotionally rich character arcs and character dynamics as well. I would absolutely love another book set in this same world, but for now I'll give this one 4.5 stars. Lastly, as if all that wasn't enough, I finished out Pride Month by listening to my ALC of Volatile Memory by Seth Haddon. This comes out from Tor.com on July 22nd, but I got access to an early audiobook courtesy of Macmillan Audio, which is read by Emily Gibbons Bouchard. I didn't know this going into it, but this is apparently the first book in a new sci-fi duology. It's set in an intergalactic empire in space where people use high-tech masks that are fashioned after animals, and depending on the animal, that gives the user different skills. The main character is a trans woman named Willa who is a scavenger, and she spends her days tracking down rare tech to sell off, and one day she receives a distress beacon of sorts that leads her to an incredibly rare mask. The problem is, of course, she is not the only scavenger to pick up on this signal, and to make things even more complicated, she finds out that there appears to be a human consciousness fused into the mask. Content warnings for graphic depictions of blood, injury, violence, and death. Some experience transphobia, and references to infertility, experience misogyny, and marital abuse. I think Seth Haddon has established a really compelling sci-fi world in this first book. The technology is fascinating, the strange relationship between Willa and Sable, the consciousness trapped in the mask, is incredibly enticing, and I think conceptually there's so much for the reader to consider in a very short space. What really struck me about this story is not only that it's a testament to trans rage, which, as I always say, is so incredibly sacred and precious and necessary, but it's also paralleling the very trans experience of embodying multiplicity in so many different ways, with the mask technology, with Sable being fused into a mask without a body, and with Willa herself. Through this almost sci-fi thriller plotline, the story is able to organically pose so many interesting questions about what it means to have a body, what kind of politics are mapped onto our bodies, where does humanity begin and end, where does consciousness begin and end, and I think those are all very worthwhile questions. The connection between Willa and Sable is absolutely where the story is strongest. They have a very queer relationship, not just because both of them identify as women, but because they are actively queering the boundaries and definitions of intimacy in really strange and fascinating ways. And when all is said and done, they are both women that society could not control, which is why they both became targets and why the powers that be are hell-bent on destroying them both. And it's so satisfying to see them fight back against that, both for each other and for themselves. So there's definitely a lot here to enjoy and to think about. I do think the pacing is a little bit off at times, and I did find myself wishing that this first installment was a little more broad in scope, but I still enjoyed this overall and would happily read another book in this series. I gave this first book 4 stars. So those are all the books I read in June. I am very tired of talking, but I will give you a quick overview of my final Queer Lit Readathon bingo board. Now keep in mind, not everything I read this month counted towards the board, but here's how it shook out by the end of the month. I counted Camp for the Outside Prompt, Dan and Green Gables for Small Town Queers, I Made My Free Space, TBR Wrecker, and counted both Sex Is and Sex Does, and Puzzle Heart towards that space. Volatile Memory, being a novella written by a queer Australian author, counted towards both Short and Sweet and Australian author, of course. The No Girlfriend Rule counted for Plus Size MC, Alligator Tears and Cosmic Love at the Multiverse Hair Salon counted for 2025 release. Flight of the Fallen went towards One Time Author, The Darkness Outside Us counted for both Banned Book and Borrowed, Puzzle Heart was also borrowed, my 1990s pick was ASL, and I Am the Dark That Answers When You Call was counted towards the continued space. So I ended up with 4 bingos, one going across the second row, the diagonals going in both directions, and a vertical bingo in the last column as well, so I would count that as a success. At long last, that is everything I have for you today. If you've read or plan to read any of the books I talked about today, I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.